Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to be in the only chapter in the book of Philemon. Philemon is one of the three New Testament books which span only a single chapter. The others are the second and third epistles of John, and the only Old Testament book is Obadiah, which spans one chapter. But there is a lot of it's densely packed epistle, and no word of Elohim is any less valid than any other. And the situational circumstance which forms the context of this writing was Paul was imprisoned in Rome somewhere around the year 60 or 62 AD when he came across an escaped slave by the name of Onesimus, who belonged to a master Philemon, who was a believer of some status and significance in the Colossian assembly. So Onesimus was the human link between them both, and Paul encourages the escaped and renegade slave who may have swindled his master and found his way into Rome, where he hoped to cover himself in obscure anonymity, but Providence had placed him in the path of Paul. So he encourages this runaway slave to return home and writes this letter to his master, pleading him to forgive him and receive him in open welcome and loving arms as if he never went away. And this touches on the institution of slavery, which was a fact of life in the ancient world. Paul never outright endorses the institutions, but he does accept it, and this is consistent throughout the Old Testament and New Testament. Any pre-industrial society required slave labor to compete in the geopolitical balance of power, and the ancient Hebrews were no exception, but they very much were the exception in that they outlined specific limitations. For one, they could not enslave their own people, and the specific limitations of the duration which they could hold the slaves, and also the limitations of how the masters could treat them. In this, they were very much the exception. But in the New Testament times, when Israel is an independent nation no longer, but is a subject province of the Roman Empire, who at certain points of its phase, up to a half to 2/3 of their entire population was enslaved. And Paul didn't seek to upset that. He accepted it as a fact of life, but he did preach the paradox of liberation through the slave and the humbleness, the humility of the ruler that the good news brings. And I've commented on this most extensively in, you can type in Corey Johnston 1 Timothy 6 for more thoughts on the slave. But that just is a sufficient introduction. That being said, we're going to open with the opening verse, which reads, Paul, a prisoner of Messiah Yahshua, and Timothy, the brother of Philemon, our beloved one and fellow worker. Now, Paul was a literal prisoner at this point in time in a Roman prison, but in some sense he had been imprisoned to the Messiah ever since he set out on the road to Damascus with the intent to arrest and imprison believers of the new Christian faith. Who should he encounter but the resurrected Messiah in visible form, who arrested him and enlisted him to his service. And so henceforth he considered himself a prisoner of the Messiah in a figurative sense. This was in a literal sense. And Timothy, the bulk of the writing belongs to Paul, but Paul liked to include Timothy or co-workers in his musings. And Timothy, we can imagine, might have been a link to Philemon, who he calls a beloved one. He's an object of his love, concern, and affection, and a fellow worker or a co-worker. So the spread of the good news is not a solitary effort. No one of us can do it alone, and no one of us can do it apart from the spirit of Elohim. So this is a team effort, and he's enlisting a team member to accept in open arms a fellow team member who was temporarily lost but can be found back in his home. and Aphia, our sister, and Acropos, our fellow soldier, and the assembly at your house. Now, the earliest assemblies, the arrival of churches, would not begin in physical structures, designated locations, until Christianity was legalized as the official state religion of the Roman Empire. Prior to then, the congregations met in houses, so we can imagine that Philemon's house would have been the location of the Colossian assembly to which he belonged. Grace to you and peace from Yahweh our Father and the Son Master Yahshua Messiah. I always thank my Elohim when mentioning you in my prayers. So he wishes him grace and peace. No one can argue against those. Those are blessings that every fellow believer by right ought to bestow, or at least pray for, on other believers. And the attitude of his prayer was one of persistent gratitude, and we learn that Philemon was the object and target of many of his prayers. Paul had him in his mind frequently enough to it be a repeated cycle, especially at this moment in time. Hearing of our love in the faith which you have towards the Master Yahshua and towards all the saints. So he's appealing to his sense of love and faith, which he has towards all the saints, and the escaped renegade slave, who was technically his property, would have been included in the all of the saints, because the Christian assembly welcomes slaves and masters and white and black and male and female. It observes neither socioeconomic, societal status, barriers, restrictions, or exclusions. We are all one and all equal in the Messiah, so that the sharing of your faith might become working in the knowledge of all the good which is in you towards Messiah Yahshua. So he's putting his faith to the test. How's he going to respond when he's asking him to do what he's about to ask him to do, which was to accept a renegade slave who may have swindled him, but certainly ran away from his charge, and slaves were, legally speaking, property. They had no freedom of movement unless, of course, they escaped. And so if he forgived him, that would set perhaps a dangerous precedent in society at large, but ultimately an exemplary precedent for the Christian community, who is to welcome back the lowly among us. And the accurate, how we treat the least among us is an accurate depiction and reflection of how we treat the Master himself. This is the juxt of the tail end of Matthew 25. For we have much joy and encouragement in your love, because the tender affections of the saints have been refreshed by you, brother. So he's saying that his love, which precedes him and is well known, being embodied in him, was a source of joy and encouragement for Paul personally. And he noticed that Onesimus was not the only one who had been refreshed by his love. So he's asking him to refresh and renew and rejuvenate this lost member of his house back fully into the arms of the flock of the faithful. Therefore, although I have much boldness in Messiah to command you what is fitting, because of love I rather appeal, being such a one as Paul the aged, and now also a prisoner of Yahshua Messiah. So Paul had apostolic authority, and he by right could have commanded this lesser-ranking saint to do what he did, but he doesn't do that. He doesn't violate his agency. He does not impose any demands. Rather, he pursues the diplomatic avenue of appealing and petitioning to his love. And when love is present, the law is no longer necessary. This is what Paul writes in the tail end of Galatians 5. So through that love, he is expecting him and implicitly commanding him to accept the return of the renegade slave in open and loving arms. I appeal to you for my child Onesimus, whom I brought forth while in my chains. So while he was a literal prisoner, somehow this escaped slave was providentially placed in his path, and the purpose for that placement was in order to give Philemon the opportunity to express a powerful witness to the Christian community of forgiving his slave. By every right, he could have him killed, if not severely punished, but he's to receive him in open arms as if he was never away. That is how Abraham Lincoln, when it was asked to him how should he accept the renegade Confederate states when the war was finally over, and he said as if they had never been away. So they were fully restored to all the rights and status and privileges and prerogatives of states in the Union that they had temporarily ceded from. Who formerly was of no use to you, but now is of good use to you and to me. So there's actually a play on words when we understand that Onesimus's name translates as useful, and this was to be embodied by slaves. They are useful to masters, and but he's also putting Philemon to the test to recognize the usefulness not only for himself but the larger community of accepting this temporarily lost brother into the arms of the faithful flock. Whom I sent back to you, and receive him, that is, my own tender affections. So Paul had evidently spent enough time to form a rich and bonding affection towards the escaped slave who Providence placed in his path. We don't know if Onesimus was a Christian prior to this, but for after the encounter, he undoubtedly was, else he wouldn't have accepted Paul's invitation to return to his master with the assurance that he is loving by nature, and as an expression of that love, he will forgive him and he will restore him as if he was never away. Whom I wanted to keep with me, that on your behalf he might serve me in my change for the good news. So the mission and the ministry, there was nothing that could slow Paul down. He continued to witness and proclaim the name even whilst in his chains, and this is expressed in the passage of the first chapter of Philippians, where he expresses that his chains, him being in chains and enduring willingly the persecution that was inflicted on him, had advanced the spread of the good news. And he wanted to keep him with him. If it was up to him for surely selfish reasons, he needed all the comfort and help he could have while he was in his present predicament, but he knew better, and he wanted to send him back in order to form a more beneficial and widespreading testimony of the grace of forgiveness. But without your opinion I wanted to do naught, so that your good deeds should not be by way of necessity, but voluntarily. So once more, he respects and does not violate his moral agency. He's giving him the power to choose, with the implicit admonition to choose correctly, to receive him and forgive him, to practice what he had preached of forgiving and loving all those who did us harm or injured us in any way. For he departed for a while, possibly because of this, so that you might have him back forever. So even when a stray sheep leaves the fold, the good shepherd will leave the 99 behind who are secure in their salvation to seek out and save and rescue the lost sheep. And that is likened to Onesimus' situation, in that he had departed from the flock, or at least where he rightfully and legally belonged to, and the purpose for him returning was to be permanent, so he would never have to worry about him packing up and leaving and departing his service ever again. No longer as a slave, but more than a slave, as a beloved brother, especially to me, and how much more to you, both in the flesh and in the master. So he's asking him to receive him not only as a slave, but to build on that foundation as a brother. Brother denotes status of equality, And the slave-master relation was by no means equal, but in the church, all of the society's divisions and classifications are rendered equal through the source of our unity and equality, which is the Messiah. So he's asking him to do this both for the flesh and for the master, who is the Messiah. So if you regard me as your partner, receive him as you would me. So Paul not only preaches equality, but is asking Philemon to equate Onesimus, one brother to another, as fully restored, as equal as if he would Paul. So he's asking him to accept this lowly slave with the same dignity, honor, and warmth that he would an apostle, a certified apostle, which was the supreme authority in the primitive church. But if he has wronged you or owes you whatever, put that on my account. So Paul is not laying him on the lap. The implicit inferences of this is that Onesimus might have robbed his master and used that money to run away and hide in the obscure anonymity of the Roman metropolis, which was to the west of the assembly of Colossus, which would have been somewhere on the Aegean Peninsula. And this is a species of compensatory sacrifice. In other words, what someone owes or what you owe them, you voluntarily pay back and you assume the debts of others. And Paul was very much willing to do this. He was not asking, he was incentivizing him to return whatever motive he might have had for not accepting the restoration of this slave. He had the assurance that Paul would financially compensate him for any loss that he may have encountered on account of this. I, Paul, write with my own hand, I shall repay, not to mention you, that you indeed owe yourself to me also. Paul typically wrote through the writings which are attributed to Paul were physically written by scribes and people he dictated verbally the contents which were communicated in the written form. But he's reminding Philemon that he is indebted to him, most likely for his conversion, and he's reminding him of his debt, and he's offering him the opportunity to repay the debt forward. That is something he cannot pay back. The one who converts us, we cannot convert them, but we can ask them to receive those who are lost, those who have injured them, those who have wronged them, with loving and open arms. Yes, brother, let me derive pleasure from you in the Master. Refresh my tender affections in the Master. Trusting in your obedience, I write to you, knowing that you shall do even more than I say. So why is he writing at all then? What is the purpose if he already knows in advance that he has complete and perfect trust that he's going to obey the order, but there is no line of advice or recommended path to pursue in the absence of the written word, and he's expecting him or trusting him to not only do the things he suggests, but to go above and beyond them, and that is an extraordinary extension of the call of duty that he is extending him. And at the same time, also prepare a place for me to stay, for I trust that through your prayers I shall be given to you. So Paul was aware of the fact that he would not remain in bondage forever. He does have hope for a quick the duration of his incarceration will be temporary, and he plans on visiting Philemon in the city of Colossus, and before he makes a place for him to stay, he's asking him to accept and prepare a way he's going to welcome and accept and provide hospitality for him in his own slave. Epaphras, fellow prisoner of me, and Messiah Yahshua greets you. Epaphras would have been the foundational father of the assembly at Colossus. There is no evidence that Paul ever visited the city, although he certainly was concerned for them, as evidence in the writing of the epistle, which bears his name. But in the 7th verse of the 1st chapter of that book, we learn that Epaphras was, for all intents and purpose, the one who began the assembly at Colossus, and he may or may not have been a convert of Paul, but in any case, he was the direct source of the foundation of that assembly. Excuse me. Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, Luke, my fellow workers, the grace of our Master Yahshua, Messiah, be with you, be with your spirit. Amen. Now, two of those names we instantly recognize as authors of Gospels. Mark, whose name was John Mark, he's called Mark to distinguish him from the apostle by that name, who also wrote a work of Scripture. And Paul did not have a completely steady relationship with him. We learn in the 12th chapter of Acts that Mark prematurely departed from the missionary. He was a biological cousin of Barnabas, and Paul eventually amended the wounded relationship between him, and he is referenced frequently throughout these epistles as being restored to his trust and affection. And Luke, the primary source of Luke's theology was Paul. So if Mark, he was an intimate of Peter, and what motivated the writing of the Gospel of Mark was the death of Peter, because they were increasingly aware that all of the apostles who had visible, tangible witness of the Master would not be around forever, hence necessitating the writing of his deeds for posterity to benefit from. But Luke wrote not only the Gospel, which bears his name, but the book of Acts, whereby after the 13th chapter, Paul replaces Peter as the human protagonist in that book. But Luke's theology was very much motivated by Paul's, and he closes with a wish for the grace of the Master to be with your spirit. Who can argue with that? That is something we all should do and cannot do without. So I'm glad you're here, and I wish you the same grace of the Master Yahshua Messiah to be with your spirit. And that's all the time we have for today, but thank you so much for being here. I will see you soon. Take care until then. Bye-bye.